Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third Conversatory on racism, important conversations about race in America. These have been coordinated by Mara Kolesas, professor. Professor Kolesas, go ahead and start.
There I am. So, good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here in this third event of our conservatory on racism at the Front Institute, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Wadie Said. He is faculty at the University, law faculty at the University of South Carolina, has a career as a faculty and as a public defender in complex terrorism, cases in Florida, in New York, also as a litigation associate, and his work challenges terrorism and national security prosecutions, and also covering due humanity and legal process for those charged with terrorism charges. And he's also author of the book Crimes of Terror, and we'll be discussing today his latest article, The American Security State. It is my great pleasure to have you here, Wadie. Good morning.
Morning, Mara. Thank you very much for that generous introduction.
So we've been discussing different angles of racism, and in a recent article, The American Security State, you make a very, very compelling argument, bringing policing not only as how it relates to Blacks in the US, but also three sectors of the state, namely national security, crime, and immigration. Could you elaborate on these aspects?
Yes, for sure. And thank you very much for the question. I think when I had started, when I left practicing law and wanted to focus on research and writing about developments in the law, I was focused largely on the terrorism prosecution, this idea that, prosecution in federal court is, of course, much better than, military commissions in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and the idea that this was a kind of a panacea, like a cure-all for our government's focus to countering terrorism. And I, having worked in a bunch of these cases, of course, on the defense side, saw that there were all sorts of problems that were not really fit for resolution in the courtroom. They needed lots of research, and they needed to be kind of written on at length. That's not something that lends itself to resolution in front of a judge who's, more often than not going to tell a public defender, that your motion is denied and to move on. And this was a long-term project of research that, as you mentioned, culminated in a book. And what I was trying to document was the fact that when you set up in a criminal prosecution, when you use terrorism charges, all the protections that are there in the law and in procedure for a criminal defendant start to get eroded because the government keeps saying, well, this is a case involving national security. But what I was noticing was those precedents didn't just exist for the terrorism prosecution. They existed also for, ordinary criminal cases, ordinary criminal prosecution as well. So when the book was finished, it came out in 2015, and then I updated it slightly in 2018. I wanted to turn to sort of a new phase of seeing the effects of this national security or counterterrorism paradigm on, ordinary policing and on other areas. So this article is maybe the second one that I've done after the book that looks at these types of phenomena. And also, I noticed that, immigration, which is something that probably people don't give a great deal of thought to, but there's a whole kind of immigration enforcement apparatus that operates in this country that's basically outside of public view, and it's not subject to the same type of requirements as, criminal prosecutions in federal and state court. They come with a whole host of protections and notice and the right to counsel that you don't have in the immigration context. So this counterterrorism logic, I felt, was kind of migrating from what it was initially posited for, this kind of more narrow, kind of counterterrorism or criminal terrorism case. And now we see the logic extending, that is to say, allowing the government, allowing the police, allowing the immigration authorities more and more leeway in different contexts. And that's what I'm really kind of focused on now, and I'm currently engaged in trying to see how this logic extends into things like the right to protest. I mean, this past summer and in the fall, we saw, the issue of the right to protest kind of come to the fore. And a lot of these similar principles are at play.
Yeah, that's great. What really, I mean, I found the argument incredibly compelling to bring these three lines. We've been discussing in this conversatory on racism and othering, and you put it in the figure of a foreigner. Like these three lines kind of like construct, a figure of a foreigner that is the target, right, of that war on terror, war on crime, and war on immigration. And it really, hit me in an interview that you gave for The Intercept some like 5 years ago. I think I may be wrong. You said, that you were kind of influenced by your father's scholarship about, the other as a violent, irrational, and actually you saw that incredibly clearly in your practice, as a public defendant. And once those stereotypes migrate actually to the realm of persecution, and if you have a funny name, and I'm quoting, if you have a funny name and darker skin and are facing charges like this, then really good luck to you. Could you elaborate on that?
Right. Yes. Well, I think there's other than me trying to be funny, which I'll of course reserve judgment on whether that was successful. There was a moment, I think I had grown up with these ideas, as you mentioned. Obviously my father's work was of great influence, in shaping my own thoughts. Especially, he had written a book. I mean, probably, many of today's participants and attendees would recognize the book Orientalism, which is, I think, his most enduring work and most influential work. But he also wrote a book shortly after that, excuse me, in a similar vein called Covering Islam: How the Media and the Experts Determine, how we view the Middle East. And, I think what was really striking about that is if you read Covering Islam today, which was written, I think, in 1981, and you just change the names and the dates, you'd see a lot of the same problems in terms of how the Middle East is covered and how people of Middle Eastern origin are essentialized, that they're kind of, they're basically one step removed from being a terrorist, right? There's a proxy for terrorism. At the time, maybe before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, it maybe would have been more restricted to the Arab world, but with the Iranian Revolution and the Islamic bent of that revolution, now the discussion became more about Islam as opposed to the Arab world, which are of course not the same thing. But the main thing was this idea of essentializing someone, and you see this also as well in the idea that was also gaining a lot of traction at the time I graduated from law school and also started practicing, of the idea that racial profiling was wrong, that because someone is, African American, they're more likely to be a drug dealer, which is, just rank speculation and essentialization. And this concept of someone because of their race or their background as a proxy for being something more dangerous or a threat was, something that I felt needed to be challenged, needed to be, confronted, because you see it. I mean, when I was, for example, a public defender and I was working on a terrorism prosecution, and the defendants all kind of looked like me and had names like me. And, there was one prosecutor in general I felt was focusing on me as kind of, different, not to be trusted, sort of like these people on trial. And, I definitely didn't appreciate it. And I wanted to, find a way to effectively counter that. And, it's not easy, it demands a lot of detail, it demands a lot of nuance, especially in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. I don't know how many people were really receptive to hearing that they're not all like that, or we're not all like that, or these kind of crazy arguments, reductive arguments that you wish you didn't have to make. And I think to be, what I kind of chanced on, or not chanced on, but sort of encountered, was how critical it is for, whatever prosecuting authority, whether it's the federal government, whether it's the immigration authorities, whether it's the local, local police and local prosecutors. It really helps for them. I mean, I don't think it helps us as a society, but it certainly helps kind of push the prosecutorial mission when you can point to the defendant and say, it's not like us. They're different. They're foreign. They're not really from here. Obviously, that's the greatest challenge is in, America's inner cities and, and communities who have been here as long as there's been a United States, to refer to them as, to refer to the African American population as foreign is perhaps a little bit harder to kind of pull off. But you do see that element of othering that becomes almost like it has to construe the threat as foreign. And I was very intent on trying to probe this and pick at it to say that I don't agree with this line of thinking.
That is a super compelling argument, because what you do in this article that I'm going to recommend, but maybe you can elaborate, is that by construing the terrorist Islamist, but it travels also at some point in a conference you gave, in London, from the Palestinian to the Arab to the Islamist. There was like a precedent in figure that traveling to terrorism. And then Blacks coming from slavery outside of the police, let's say, to be police, and the immigrant, they're outside, the rights of citizenship, even though not formally, right? They are outside the rights of citizenship. So would you explain legally how that plays? I mean, in terms of acts, in terms of racial profiling?
Well, I think, yeah. So I think that there was a brief moment in, starting in the late 50s through till the mid 50s through to the late 60s, where, I'm sure, many of the people on this, Zoom conversation have, remember the era of the so-called Warren Court. Earl Warren, the former governor of California, then who had his own kind of, I'd say generously, I would say it was a checkered history with respect to the Japanese internment during World War II, who had played a very, I think, not so positive role. In fact, we would say a very, kind of a dastardly role in the Japanese internment, became a kind of a liberal hero later on in his life when he became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In fact, there's been much ink spilled about the Warren Court and its kind of criminal procedure, specifically criminal law and criminal procedure revolution, where they invalidated as unconstitutional all sorts of laws, criminalizing things like loitering. The police could basically up until this era in the mid 50s, the late 60s, the police could basically just pick up anybody at will and say they were loitering. There were these loitering statutes on the books, and those were invalidated as unconstitutional. They were seen as too vague. You have to know what it is you're being charged with, or being kind of accused of. And this idea of notice, or what in the law has been, kind of referred to as procedural due process. You're entitled to due process. You're entitled to know the charges against you and have a chance to defend yourself adequately against them. You're entitled to an attorney if you can't afford one. This was all the Warren Court era. And after that era ended in the late 60s, the Supreme Court has just been kind of lurching further and further right. I think on the screen I'm going left, but I'm going to my right. And I'm sure everybody followed the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, and before that, the Kavanaugh hearings. And the Supreme Court has become obviously a huge battleground for America's kind of, and emblematic of America's kind of fractured state. I think it's in that context, that you see, with this lurch towards the right, this sort of backlash against the Warren Court, and this idea that criminal defendants, criminals, were given too many rights, too many protections. And that's been slowly chipped away at over years. So that trend that I was talking about earlier about counterterrorism was just kind of maybe a more pronounced, a more kind of active and more developed version of what's been going on kind of slowly over the decades, where the police have been getting more and more power and more discretion, and criminal defendants have been getting less and less. And that logic is also kind of morphing and moving into areas like immigration enforcement, where, to begin with, non-citizens, and this is an interesting point, by the way. I use the term, and a lot of law professors who've taught me and I've learned from use the term non-citizen. But if you look at the immigration law, the word for a non-citizen is alien. They use the word alien, which of course has all sorts of baggage and connotations, negative connotations. And I think what you see is this kind of trend to deny those who are less popular, without means, more on the margins in society, protections, and have discretion and powers accrue more and more to the government, to law enforcement, to the police, to the point where we get today, where we see people in the streets, mass protests, because it's kind of beyond the capacity of our system to contain, just in so many different ways. And one of the ways is the fact that a development in a terrorism prosecution can now make its way into immigration enforcement, which then makes its way into a local state prosecution for drug possession, and that's what I was kind of concerned with.
You mean in terms of precedent, that it migrates from one to the other? Because we've discussed this in the past. But if you can just backtrack a little bit and
Sure.
and refer to the history of policing in the US, it actually starts as out of slave patrols, basically. So it's the police for those who do not belong to the police, right? If you can refer to that, and how also, you talk about how at a certain point it's shaped after military. So there's an imbrication between police and the military here.
Yes, so there's a couple of things. So the historical point, I think, the police coming out of slave patrols, that's especially been highlighted now in the sort of recent protests, and the fact that Black Lives Matter, which predates, of course, which really came out of the 2014, kind of protests in Ferguson over the killing of Michael Brown in the summer of 2014, and then has just kind of come back to the fore. Never went away, but just kind of came, sort of reemerged in the public consciousness this past summer with the killing of George Floyd by the police in Minneapolis. I mean, the history of the police is obviously troubling and has troubling it's a troubling legacy for sure. And I think what when I was talking about the Warren Court, even before that, I think there was a point in which in the post-Civil War America and the failure or the defeat of Reconstruction, which took place where I'm currently sitting in South Carolina and other states of the former Confederacy. What you saw was, local policing, federal policing was kind of very, very narrow. It only took place in very narrow context. So local policing was basically the whole show, and it was largely unregulated. And then there was a series, and then what ended up happening was in the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, this country, especially the American South, experienced an epidemic of lynching, racially based lynching, which was obviously, horrifying. I mean, and the sort of the scholars and groups and historians who've written about this, refer to it as, terrorism, in the most basic sense of the word. By the way, there is no universally agreed upon definition of terrorism.
I was going to ask you.
Just as a sort of a side note here, but if there were one, it would almost assuredly include lynching, and what you saw was the epidemic of lynching, and the fact that local law enforcement, again, especially in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, were so deeply involved in the practice and in the process that policing looked like a kind of violent terrorism for the local African American communities. And the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, not having a great deal of ability to intervene in local law enforcement and state law enforcement and state prosecution, concocted is maybe a overly negative term, but the Supreme Court, this is starting in the 20s, basically in reaction to a couple of famous cases like that of the Scottsboro Boys, which were a group of young black men who had been accused of raping white women in Alabama, and they were basically going to be, they were going to be lynched if the authorities didn't intervene. But their trial and their arrest and their interrogation and their trial were essentially, it was a sham process. There was a railroad. They were railroaded and beaten up and forced to confess and weren't given lawyers. So in these contexts, the Supreme Court felt the need to intervene. And it started to, insist on bare minimum protections, like lawyers when someone is facing a capital charge, if they can't afford a lawyer, the state has to provide one. And so you saw these developments taking place, at a time of great strife, great strife. And, and the problem was it was very limited. The Supreme Court wasn't able to do so much. And you see that today, like that dynamic exists today, that whenever we sort of look for the Supreme Court to step in, we look for, these sort of solutions from on high, but it's not very, I don't think that's really the strategy we should be looking for as a society.
No, definitely. I have to say, I want to jump into the details, because I was going to ask you about the Supreme Court, and I want to go there later. relating, how this bias, which is far from being implicit, has been actually institutionalized and constitutionalized, right? Because once it's passed by the Supreme Court, it doesn't have just the level, institutionalized, also constitutional, but I'm putting at a higher level. For example, so then I am going to jump there since you kind of advance, unsurprisingly, what I was going to ask you in any case. Because you talk about the Fourth Amendment, right? And the bias actually that the Supreme Court has vis-a-vis the motives of the police, namely, they assume good faith on the side of the police, if I understand this correctly, and it's not my field of expertise, they assume good faith. In contrast, with a history, right, that you document very well prior to addressing, the Fourth Amendment, that says, they're basically looking for, Black people as criminals. That's the criminal, because gangs that are listed, and if you can refer to this as well, the blacklist, watch list are mostly kind of Black, Latinos, quote unquote Islamic, because they may be Arab but Christian, or or Druze or whatever. So can you talk about the Fourth Amendment and the Supreme Court, and how that plays out?
Yes, of course. And, this is something that, for me, I'll speak in these terms. So it's kind of a cliche for law professors, maybe, I don't want to, assume knowledge too much, but I also don't want to assume that people don't know. But it's kind of a cliche for, law professors to focus on the Fourth Amendment, the idea that, that there shouldn't be, that the authorities are not allowed to search or seize kind of being like an arrest, someone without something called probable cause, which, you go to law school and you think you're going to learn what all these terms mean. And then you realize that, they're kind of that courts kind of make it, and the Supreme Court at the top of the list kind of makes it up as it goes along. What is probable cause is, dependent on, in the most famous case that the Supreme Court from the early 80s called Illinois v. Gates, where they actually finally told us what probable cause is. The definition was a fair probability under the totality of the circumstances. And every year I teach that case, I kind of mildly lose my mind in front of my students, because, that's a very malleable standard. And I'm saying it quite generously. But the Fourth Amendment is there to protect us from the overreach of the government. It's one of these kind of critical protections that, in its most heroic retelling, the colonists, the beleaguered colonists of, the 13 colonies, after they became the United States, decided to pass a protection so that agents, so that we could never have the equivalent of the agent of the crown proceeding on a so-called general warrant, which is basically like, I can search you and stop you no matter what, for whatever reason, because I've got this generalized warrant. And probable cause and a warrant requirement, the fact that the police have to go out and get a warrant, basically means they have to be specific as to the reason why someone is being stopped and searched, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's this kind of protection that's there. And in reality, the current state of things is that, there are more exceptions to this requirement that the police go out and get a warrant before stopping and seizing someone than you can count. And there's a great kind of deal of leeway that the police have, and discretion that the police have in stopping people. And in fact, the Warren Court, in one of its most criticized decisions, actually laid the legal groundwork for why the police can stop and frisk people on the street with a lesser standard, something called reasonable suspicion, which is lesser than what reasonable suspicion is. Again, I can't really tell you. But one example of reasonable suspicion is if you live in a high crime area and you run from the police, that's reasonable suspicion, which
Right.
you can, yeah.
So
I mean, these are the things about, there's this protection there, which we focus on a great deal, but in reality, things aren't always what they seem.
Right, because in terms of this reasonable suspicion, I mean, I'm going back to your point about constructing, this foreign figure, right? That is irrational and violent. And someone has asked, if you could explain more fully the term essentializing, but it goes to making them essentially violent, irrational, and kind of criminal, like a threat, right? When you construe, racial, if we can say, or ethnic slash figures as irrational, violent, a threat, so you already have a reasonable suspicion. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling argument that you put forward, right? To target those figures. Can you, and that gets institutionalized. Is that the dynamics that you see?
Well, I mean, I would say that, yes. And you said that, so I'm of course going to agree with you. I don't, to be fair, because I don't want to just have this sound to everybody, watching or listening, to think that this is just a litany, sort of a reverse litany, kind of an opposition to the police or the prosecutors. I think it's fair to say that, you need a certain level of malleability with these standards. You need a certain level of, kind of flexibility. But the problem ends up being that, I think we see law enforcement a lot of times looking for kind of bigger reasons, or tries to make these things seem scientific when they're not. So, there is, I think, at the end of the day, no real substitute for, law enforcement if they're kind of investigating a crime, trying to actually find the evidence of the crime and working towards getting evidence of the crime, not simply saying, okay, well, we have a drug deal and, let's round up the usual suspects. That is to say, this population based on their race, race is a proxy for drug dealing, or race is a proxy for terrorism, or race is a proxy for being a so-called illegal alien, as the phrase. I'm not using that myself, but you've I'm sure heard the phrase. And I think, those trends kind of die hard, even though there'll be times where they'll be disfavored in the law, or there'll be a statement, they don't always fully go away. So for example, the Department of Justice has proposed standards for racial profiling, where they say, law enforcement, we don't allow racial profiling. That is to say, race as a proxy for criminality. Okay. And, that's great. But, federal law enforcement is only a small part of law enforcement and criminal prosecutions throughout the country. Two is specifically, racial profiling is allowed in the immigration enforcement context, and yes, in the proposed guidelines. So, and also in certain national security investigations, racial profiling can be allowed. So, there are kind of limits to what can be done, or what is willing to be done. One of the tragic things about racial profiling is, in the late 90s, there were a series of incidents. Like the state police in New Jersey shot up a car full of young African American men. There may have been one woman in the car, but they shot up the car and injured people. And it turned out that they were basically being profiled, that the state police in New Jersey, basically were operating according to a profile that said, if you see, young Black people in a car, they're drug dealers, you should pull them over. And of course, they didn't pull over, and it became an issue, and they got shot at. And the state police in New Jersey ultimately entered into, a consent decree in that case, basically saying, we're going to train our officers, we're going to stop racially profiling, we'll train our officers not to do that. A similar thing happened in Maryland with their state police, where they were pulling over. They had a profile. If you see a young Black man in a car, drug dealer, pull him over. And it got to the point where right before the September 11th, 2001 attacks, there was a bill pending in Congress to end racial profiling. And President George W. Bush at the time had indicated his support and that he was going to sign the bill. But then the attacks happened, and that bill, died and never came back.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, this is the thing, is that the attractiveness of this, or maybe attractiveness isn't the right word, but the durability, there's a better word, the durability of this type of thinking, really endures. And it's very hard to rid ourselves of it, whenever people from, my background, whenever we read about any type of, attack, violent incident anywhere in the world, we think, oh my gosh, I hope that, it's not an Arab guy or a Muslim guy who did this, and you're seeing, by the way, and I'll be, I'll try to be a little bit, again, more, what's the word, nuanced. People tell me I need to be more nuanced. So I can say that at the very least, I can say it's not as bad here as, say, France, where it's basically open war on Muslims in France right now. And the government there is going really bonkers and passing bills that we don't have here, thankfully. So it's not as if the United States is the worst or the only place where this type of profiling can happen, essentializing, basically saying someone in their essence is violent because of their background or their essence. But it's that the effects of what goes on here, what transpires here, are so great. They have a worldwide kind of, they echo worldwide. And so I think it's really important, in the context of understanding the effects of what happens here, outside as well, not just internally, but outside as well.
Because, your argument for me is fascinating. Everyone knows I'm Argentine. You know too, you know that too. But it was fascinating. Fascinating and terrifying. As an Argentine who grew up during dictatorship, I have to say, for me, the idea that the American state was a security state and trained, military dictatorships all over the world was not news, right? Mm-hmm. But I had no clue, for example, that there was a facility in Chicago, right? As you mentioned, that basically did not disappear people because those people came back to society, as opposed to what happened in Argentina. But basically they were swallowed by the facility. They were I don't remember if 80% Black. I don't remember the figure. Oh, here it is. Between, you say, 2004 and 2015, the police made 7,185 arrests at the facility known as Homan Square. 68% or 0.94 of those individual arrested were allowed access to an attorney. So that is the police acquiring discretion well beyond due process and a constitutional state, right? Can you explain how that was possible and what happened with that?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because, so again, the culture wars over the Supreme Court and who's on the Supreme Court are, huge and, kind of national news. And we look at what the Supreme Court has to say, and we would assume something like this, the police operating a kind of an incommunicado detention facility in the middle of America's third largest city is, we would assume it couldn't possibly happen. But and it shouldn't. And politically, I think Home and Square has been shut down because it caused an outcry. But why it's allowed to happen is because of the nature of our, constitutional system, which basically, the main remedy for a violation of the Fourth Amendment is, so if someone's arrested or seized or searched without probable cause, usually the main remedy is if they're charged with a crime and the evidence from that illegal search or seizure, unconstitutional search or seizure, makes its way into the prosecution, the main remedy is the court will throw it out. It's called the exclusionary rule. That evidence will be excluded. And that's the main remedy. So if you're searched or seized unconstitutionally, but you never get charged with a crime, your only recourse is to sue the police. And, that's pretty hard to do if you're, if you're marginalized, you don't have access to an attorney. Oftentimes the police, will, the police enjoy something called qualified immunity. So even if they did something like violate someone's constitutional rights, if they weren't acting according to what is known as in the Supreme Court precedent as clearly established law, which they should have known, they're not going to be held accountable. So something like this could exist in a world where the constitutional scheme, constitutional protections don't really provide a readily accessible remedy. So politically, once this got out, it was kind of fatal. But the remedy of kind of mass litigation, finding all these people who were arrested and getting them to sue the city. I mean, what would the city do? It would fight it, and then it would probably enter into some sort of settlement where it didn't admit liability, but pledged to not do it again. And that's, kind of cold comfort for the rest of us who just have to hope that it wouldn't happen again.
But this is 11 years. It's like longer than the last Argentine dictatorship. It's just 11 years. And also, I mean, you talk about the watch list and the blacklist. I mean, and blacklist is not a pun intended, but it's like literally, a blacklist, right? In terms of crime, you talk about that there are blacklists in New York, right? With, mostly Black, 70% of the people in the blacklist, Black, but also there are like blacklists in California with 65 because of the population in that list of Latinos, right?
Yeah, and these are gang watch lists. So gang is another term that, I mean, the deployment of the term gang or gang member is also a racially loaded term. I think in California, if you were, you see that it's interesting in California, the state prison guards union is very powerful. And state prisons in California are they used to be by policy segregated. Right, they would prison administration would segregate the prisons by race, and I mean I think that policy, while maybe legally overturned, I think it exists in some form today. And the issue of the gang, especially the ethnic gang, is something. Not to say that there isn't a problem with gang-related crime or gang-related violence, but it's something that, the authorities, whether, the police or prison authorities, I don't want to say they puff it up, but I certainly have my own kind of, my own skepticism when I see statistics on, gang activities and gang, the use of the gang kind of moniker or gang watch list definitely has the potential for being abused, right? And you see that, you see that. So it's not to say that there are no gangs or dangerous gang members. It's that once these powers are used broadly to target wide swaths of the population, then you have the potential for abuse. And then you see stuff like, in Los Angeles, 6-month-old baby was on the gang watch list. Things that are crazy happen because it's, you're dealing with marginalized populations, vilified populations, and the oversight, enforcement, kind of narrow construction of these powers just isn't there.
And you actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you actually point out that no one knows how people make it to this kind of gang list, and it's very difficult to remove someone from being in that gang list. And together with that, if I may, but you make this argument that non-immigrant whites, just to be completely, open in criminal activity, they're not seen as being a gang, right? And there are no ramifications in terms of connections to include them and their associates, friends, or extended circle into, the watch list, right?
Yes, and to make a couple of quick points, that's, when I wrote the paper, that was certainly, the focus was, the sort of Black and Latino street gangs, prison gangs. There is an acknowledgement that there are kind of white supremacists, especially prison gangs. And I think what we've seen in the past several years is that the notion of the sort of the extreme right, the threat that the extreme right poses has been downplayed and needs to kind of be explored more. And that the stereotypes that we've been kind of fed on don't tell us the whole picture. So that's one thing for sure to point out, that since the paper came out, there's been an understanding in the context of all these sort of mass shootings and right-wing inspired shootings and protest activity now, that there's this danger that's not just, from the inner city or from the immigrant communities or even, terrorism, that there's this threat from the right wing, which also has obviously a kind of a racial component to it, that these are people of European origin, Americans of European origin. So that is challenging this type of thinking a little bit. But I think one of the things to bear in mind is, and this goes to your point now about, how do you get on? I think, I'll count myself, and I mean, I don't know how many other people share this, but I would say a fair number of people think that despite all the dysfunction and all the kind of strife that we've witnessed in the last however many years, and et cetera, we still think that the government kind of, works on a most basic level, okay? And we do treat the government, with good faith when it comes to certain services it provides, and, and certain, kind of general maintenance and concern for the general welfare. And I think where that starts to become hard for people to process is the idea that you would think that there's someone who is informed and has a conscience and feels responsible and feels accountable, who makes decisions like who goes on a gang watch list, or in the terrorism context, who goes on a no-fly list, right? In the federal kind of terrorism enforcement context. And often what we find is it's a kind of a, the emperor has no clothes type of situation where, it's not that, it's not that well structured. It's not that well defined. There is no process for appeal. There is no real recourse if you get put on that list, other than, get a lawyer and try to fight, and, hope that you make enough noise and, get in front of the right, manage to get the case heard by a judge or whatever. But that's, litigation is complicated and expensive. So, we're assuming good faith on the part of the people making these decisions. And I don't know that that's always the proper assumption. Let's just put it like that.
Right. I mean, and there are two parallel issues. One is like the issue of equality among citizens and non-equality, even though you are a citizen, right? And the other is, the pretense of assumption of innocence that is supposed to be the basis of the judicial, system, whereas what you are demonstrating in detail with for example, the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organization Acts and all these other legal things that you mentioned, that is the presumption of culpability, of criminality a priori. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's that complete inversion of the principle of a juridical system. So how do you address that because you have an implication between, we haven't talked too much about this, but the military make it into the police make it into the military, immigration enforcement, they're like coming more and more together, like carving out more and more spaces from what we could, let me put this for the sake of the question, a constitutional core that, where the guarantees still function for some. So you point out the more you carve out that space for the police, outside oversight, the more difficult it is just to come back.
Yeah, and that's an interesting, yes, you mentioned that earlier, and I did want to address it, the issue of the militarization of the police. And there's been a lot of coverage of this issue. Investigative journalists have been covering the idea that it was actually I think in the Clinton administration that you started to see, there was an act passed, I think, that allowed, the military to sell for cheap its, unused equipment to police departments, and so, the police, which is already a paramilitary structure with, ranks and the police are allowed to carry firearms and enforce order and legally deploy violence. The idea that this is akin to a military organization has been around for a long time. But when military style equipment actually started to appear on America's streets, it's interesting. I don't mean to pick on California, of course, but there was a police chief. The Los Angeles police has a very kind of checkered history, as I'm sure many of you know. But their police chief, who was actually the chief during the Rodney King beating in 1991, Daryl Gates was his name. He had earlier, in the early mid 80s, had become kind of famous for developing a military style vehicle. He kind of improvised it, called the Batter-Ram, they called it in Los Angeles. And he basically would bash in, instead of knocking on people's doors to enforce arrest warrants and whatnot, they would just, bash the door down or bash through the walls with this battering ram, mechanized battering ram that looked like some sort of military vehicle. So this exists sort of prior to the militarization component exists prior to the mid 90s, but that's when it took off. And that's why when you look and you see pictures of, or video footage of protests from around the country, the police look like they're ready for an armed battle. They look like an army. And that's obviously been a huge development in terms of straining police-citizen relations, not even on a racial basis, just how the police are perceived in society. And I know it's a hot button issue, and you've heard the people from the president-elect on down, say that we're not going to defund the police, that we love the police, that there's been a lot of unhelpful, heated rhetoric about this. But there is a fundamental question about the nature of policing as kind of as oppositional to most people's kind of sense of what a society should look like. And that's not a debate that's going away just because Trump will be his term will supposedly end in a little over a month.
Those are the words that I wanted to hear. So no, because going a little bit before to recap a little bit of the history, actually, I mean, based on Jill Lepore's article in the New Yorker, I mean, modern police as we know it today in the US, it started in 1909 in Berkeley, out of all places, modeled after the military. So after that point is, if I may make this point, is that you actually then started incorporating like the military equipment to a conception of the police that was already kind of militarized in its, in its imaginary, not only because of Vollmer, but also because it understood, Blacks as the external threat enemy to the nation, to the way of being of this country, which is, and then you had, going to your point of defund the police, you've been just this is something that everyone knows, actually removing from social services to fund the police, even, during Johnson, all these funds, federal funds that were supposed to make it to social, services were like funneled to police all over. Then he passes that crime act, and it was the end, of the Great Society. So I want to encourage everyone before, I ask you a last question to submit questions through the Q&A. And I wanted to ask you, Wadie, just to maybe the last question, and before I want to be fair to everybody. I mean, you point out sometimes that Sonia Sotomayor, I don't remember in which dissent ruling. I'm sorry, I'm not that good with these things.
Utah versus Strieff, is that the case?
Yeah, I think talk about the talk, that you should give. I mean, and that kind of acknowledgement, if you can talk about it at, at the Supreme Court justice level, it's really appalling, to say the least, because it means that she's acknowledging that you have to deal kind of individually what you actually have to address systemically, right? So
yeah, well, I want to say on that note, Sonia Sotomayor, she's a former prosecutor, and then she was a federal district court judge, a federal trial judge. Then she was on the circuit. She was a federal appeals court judge. Then she became then she was nominated and confirmed as an associate justice of the Supreme Court. So interestingly, I think, oftentimes I think you see coverage of how, individuals who are put on the Supreme Court are end up disappointing people. I think she has actually been the opposite. Her record has been quite amazing especially on these matters. Her willingness to kind of articulate these, articulate these types of sentiments. I mean, that was in a case, where the police basically stopped someone with no reasonable suspicion, let alone probable cause, and asked for ID, and then they ran an ID check and found he had a warrant for drug possession and arrested him. And she basically in that case talked about like what, you know, what it means to be policed in this country, and how your perception is different based on race. And, you know, that's a case where the police were basically allowed to, arrest and charge someone where they had literally no suspicion, not even a smaller level of reasonable suspicion to stop them. You know, so to stop and ask for ID, which, you know, you were mentioning you're from Argentina originally, and, you know, I have family in the Middle East. You know, we you know, the police and stopping you and asking, or the secret police of the military stopping you and asking you for ID is like the hallmark of that type of regime. And here we see in the United States, you know, that the police were essentially allowed to do just that. So, you know, that's something I think, maybe if I'll just, so I can kind of summarize and, you know, wrap up, my remarks are more geared toward not the idea that the police are running amok and, you know, we should all fear for our lives. No, my point is more, we should look at and try to understand just what it is, or just what those powers are that the police enjoy, that law enforcement enjoys in this country, and understand the extent of that and how they can be kind of used and employed, and that the law, the legal system, the courts, the Supreme Court are not really a check on, you know, are not really a check on the police the way that I think we've been raised to think they are.
That's a great point. Like an increase of the powers of the police, and an increase of the powers of the police, if I may add, particularly concentrated on three groups, on three areas, as you put it. This is great, very illuminating conversation. All your points are like mind blowing, even though sometimes not in the most inspiring way. But I'm going to be fair to everyone and ask questions. I see hands raising. I'm going to ask you to please write the question on the Q&A box, because we can't have access to that. So I have a first question. Daphna Levitt is asking, is there any precedent in US legal history of a senior elected official being indicted for inciting, quote unquote, terrorism? This is not a frivolous question.
No, I appreciate the question. Thank you for that. So, you know, inciting terrorism, you know, the way the law has kind of, you know, used the term terrorism, it's a more modern development, that is where it's really taken off. Not to say the term didn't exist, but that's more of a modern development. It's now you know, the focus is on, and this is a real law, it's called providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. And, you know, and that's the sort of main law used in terrorism prosecutions. So there haven't been senior elected officials who've been, as far as I know, indicted for providing material support. The closest example I could think was, if you remember back at the, you know, sort of in the early years of the American Republic, there was a figure who has now regained some prominence because of the musical Hamilton. That is to say, you know, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr ended up being indicted and you know, prosecuted, with Chief Justice John Marshall serving as the trial judge in his case, for leading some kind of, or being involved with some sort of secessionist effort in Texas. So that's the closest I could get for you, but you know, I don't want to speak too much because I'll get too far beyond what I can talk about intelligibly. But that would be the closest I can get for you. But in the modern era, I don't know of any American elected officials who were indicted for, you know, materially supporting terrorism or anything like that.
Thank you. And 2 points related to that, it's that in terms of terrorism, clearly it seems that it's like a tautology in terms of its definition, even if there's no definition, but there's no white kind of terrorism, you know, in the US, right? Like you wouldn't, I've never heard of any official voice that would call an act of like the shooting, like it happened recently, you know, by white people, like an act of terrorism. A different thing is Ireland, of course, but we're like in a completely different continent, right? And in different, so a related question is, thank you for the question. A related question is, do you think, by Sheila Hembry, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, do you think Trump is a traitor to the US?
Let me put it to you like this. I think that the idea of treason or calling someone a traitor is, you know, that's not something we should be using, you know, lightly, simply because, you know, the idea of betraying your country to another country, you know, is that what I think of when I think of treason, right? Siding with another country. And, you know, that, I mean, I don't want to be unpopular with the attendees who have patiently listened to me, but I think that that type of thinking is, I don't know that I ascribe to that, the idea of, you know, Trump as a, I mean, you can say a lot of things about the person who's currently the president of the United States, but I think traitor is maybe pushing it. I don't think that that meets the definition of treason as I understand it. But again, there are people who are more learned about this than me.
Thank you. Joanne Kinney, how can a non-legally trained citizen fight the immunity the police have? Okay, so, you know, that's a really, I want to, you know, I really think that's an incredibly valuable question, because I think a lot of us think, and I mean, I think, and I've certainly been exposed to the point of view that, you know, like, what can you really do about the police? And I can tell you that, you know, so much of what has taken place over the last 3 or 4 decades, you know, what scholars and activists call the era of mass incarceration, you know, with the idea of, you know, people serving long prison sentences for, you know, lower level crimes and drug level crimes, and the racial implications of that, you know, that phenomenon, I think, took place, or has taken place, maybe continues to take place, because so many criminal defendants, you know, don't have anybody to stand up for them, don't have anyone to come and support them. You know, I think the idea, of community involvement is really, really much more important than you think. To give you an example from my own experience, when I was involved in the main prosecution I worked on, which was in Tampa, Florida, where it was my client and 3 other guys, one of whom was a criminal, a computer science professor at the University of South Florida, who had been vilified by the local media as basically as a terrorist for 8 years before he was finally indicted. And after September 11th, he appeared on the O'Reilly program. O'Reilly had him on as a kind of a, like, you know, representative of the American Muslim community. And he thought he was going to talk about how, you know, we're all in this together and we as American Muslims condemn these violent acts. And O'Reilly basically said, you're a terrorist. If I, you know, I'm paraphrasing, of course, I don't want to get, you know, but he basically said, this is what he did say. He said, if I were the CIA, I'd follow you everywhere, you know. And sure enough, after that appearance, you know, the wheels turned and he was indicted, and it became a massive case, which was covered by, you know, the media, and everyone assumed that you know, my client and the 3 others, including the computer science professor, who was basically who the government was going after, were all going to be, you know, convicted and sentenced to life in prison for supporting terrorism. And the local Muslim community showed up in court every single day.
every single day. And that made a difference. The government, in the end, 2 of the defendants were acquitted of every charge against them. The professor was acquitted of, half the charges against them, and the jury was hung in favor of conviction, hung meaning they couldn't decide, on the other half. My client had, I think, 24 charges or 22 charges. He was acquitted of 15 of them. The other 7 or 8 were hung 10-2 in favor of acquittal. They didn't get one conviction at the jury trial. And honestly, I think that I'd like to cite my own brilliance and my colleagues' own brilliance as lawyers as the reason, but I mean, there was one lawyer who did one or two lawyers who did a really brilliant job in front of the jury, not me. But it was really the community showing up was a huge thing. And I think that, if prosecutors and judges and police and defense attorneys and defendants see more, community support, that can make a difference.
That's a wonderful point. And actually it's true that voices show, and sometimes they have impact. It's a good inspiring note. So Duane Stilwell, isn't the idea of national security one that has always been used to undermine the First Amendment, starting with anti-sedition laws? Even Lincoln suspended habeas corpus at one point, and during the McCarthy era, it became very evident as well. It's still invoked today.
Yes, for sure. I agree. The use of the term national security is, I think, I think it's problematic because of the way that it's deployed as a kind of a way to shut down an argument or shut down a discussion. And that has the knock-on effect of, curtailing people's First Amendment rights. And, I think that's, you raised the point about national security. And, I think it also highlights something that's kind of, both unique and difficult to fully digest about the U.S. legal system, which is, there is an International Court of Justice in The Hague that deals with, disputes between nations, and, there is an International Criminal Court also in The Hague that supposedly deals with, crimes of an international nature. But the real international legal system, the real international, kind of courts are the American federal, courts, right? Mm-hmm. The types of disputes they take on, not just in the criminal or national security context, but also in the, business dispute context, are just human rights, et cetera, are truly global. And, when the government has that type of trump card to deploy, it is problematic. And what we see is, this, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept that Naomi Klein, kind of termed of the shock doctrine. You wait for a massive event to take place to shake things up, and then, the system changes. And, clearly the September 11th attacks were that type of event that allowed for not just a restructure, but a kind of a reimagining of how the government should respond to an external threat and construct national security. You remember George W. Bush's first national security strategy of the United States was basically like the U.S. is going to fight terrorism everywhere. So I think, it's unfortunate that it has to be tied to such horrific events, but the further we get away from these type of deeply traumatic and violent events, we can kind of think about it more. But if something, God forbid, were to happen like that again, we'll probably be having a similar type of conversation and talking about, First Amendment rights being curtailed, and, the possibility of roundups or kind of coming up again.
Yeah, she was. I'm sorry that She also said that I raised this in a context of racism as well. She made a clarification, but you kind of, addressed that. I remember that, after I was in New York at the time of the terrorist attack, and actually I had problems the next year to renew my visa. I didn't have citizenship at the time. And, once, I crossed the Manhattan Bridge and I see like a military tank on the other side, which was, this idea, of war in inland. So Barry Emanuel asks, do you believe profiling is ever okay? And do you differentiate from racial profiling?
Okay, thank you for the question. So here's my thing about profiling. So in another article I wrote just before, a couple of years before this one, called Limitless Discretion in the War on Drugs and the War on Terror. And I don't presume anyone's going to go out and read it. It was in the University of Colorado Law Review. It's another, kind of heavily footnoted law review article that Mara was teasing me about when we spoke last week. But one of the things I pointed to there was that, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, maintains something called the Drug Courier Profile, or it maintains something called a Drug Courier Profile, which, basically is supposed to be a kind of a shorthand for figuring out when someone is, acting as a drug courier, using mass transportation or, international transport to take drugs from one country to another, or one state to another, one location to another. And the problem is that there's no uniform definition of a drug courier. So, the DEA office in Miami has a different definition for who a drug courier, for their drug courier profile is different from the DEA's office in Kansas City, which is different from the one maintained in, at the DEA headquarters in Washington, D.C. All right. And, and you ended up with situations where, what's a drug courier profile? Well, someone who bought a one-way ticket, that could be part of the drug courier profile. Someone who bought a round-trip ticket, drug courier profile. Someone who paid cash for their airplane ticket. Someone who paid with a credit card. I mean, it just became farcical that, basically anyone could be a drug courier on the basis of this profile. And the problem I have with profiles more generally is they provide what I think is a kind of a like pseudoscientific gloss to what law enforcement is doing. It makes it seem like it's based on, studied and tried and true theories and methods that are kind of, laboratory tested. When in reality, it's just a lot of times I find it looks like law enforcement making it up as they go along and then allowing themselves to kind of coat their conduct in the veneer of a kind of a more developed theory. So I'm nervous about the use of profiles in a more general context. So I think that if you were to push me, well, let me see, let me go back to the, I just want to get if you were to push me, do I believe it's ever okay? I would say I struggle to see a situation. I'm not going to rule it out, but at the present, I'm going to say I struggle to find a time where I would find it okay.
Yeah, because that's a good point. That's an excellent point, because it goes with the argument you make about prevention and the kind of legitimatory kind of umbrella it gives to all the practices that you are condemning on due process and profiling basis, right?
Yeah.
So Tracy Friedman is asking, are there examples of alternative modes of public safety police in democratic constitutional states elsewhere? This is comparative law. And a comment to that, San Francisco has taken more money from the police budget and created a force of people trained to deal with nonviolent offenses. These folks are trained to deal with mental issues public disturbances, keeping people out of jail and instead getting them assistance they need. Our goals and the outcomes are far better than if police, had been called and the person had ended up in jail. I mean, there's actually a huge issue, not only of the kind of funneling of funds from social services to the police to address these issues, but also that the constitutional structure at another level and political structure at another level of the US, which is a federal, incredibly decentralized, right, system that provides locality and localism for historic and political reasons, right, with a huge amount of discretion, as you pointed, before.
Yes, and I want to say I appreciate the question and I appreciate the question, and I also appreciate the answer also in the chat, the Q&A chat. And I think that the answer, this is sorry, Malcolm Gisson has provided an answer and also a question which suggests an answer, if I might offer my interpretation of the comment / question. But I mean, I think there's a couple of things to add also to this, which is, why should policing be based on, numbers of arrests? Why should policing, be rooted in, how many citations a police officer can write and thereby, getting money from the citizenry? The idea of policing as public safety and community protection should really, in its kind of, basic definitional posture, basically, rule out kind of lording it over the population and viewing the population as, hostile, or the community as hostile, or as an enemy, or as someone to kind of, to bust and get money from. And I think, part of the unresolved kind of racial dynamic of this country allows for policing to function like that. This idea of, community. My wife is from your part of the country, from the East Bay, and I used to kind of, I'm from New York City, and I used to kind of make fun of her because all she kept talking about was community. But it's true, there is no, like, building a community and being part of a community is very, very important to kind of existing in our modern age, and we've seen that, the way the police are positioned as kind of, in many instances, especially with these minority communities, as in opposition to them, as literally kind of, as literally, almost like an occupying army, is profoundly problematic. And when we juxtapose that with the fact that more affluent communities, white communities, don't have that relationship with the police and view the police as positive actors in society, it prevents any kind of fundamental reform on the most basic level.
Yeah, I was thinking with this answer, being from the community, and I go back to once you construe the other, because I was thinking when I was also reading, I'm jumping in, I'm abusing other time, but the three groups or spaces, the Muslims or Islam allegedly is against the US way of life. Blacks
Right.
are against kind of property, and immigration is against jobs, right? There is like this threat to our safety and living that is placed in that to justify this. But I'll leave it.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point.
I'll leave it at that. So Elizabeth Frommer asked, doesn't the DEA also profile, quote unquote, doctors who are now terrified to prescribe analgesics, painkillers, interfering with their legitimate medical decision-making and to the detriment of millions who need management for chronic painful condition? This is a little bit,
So I'll say the following, because it's, yes, I think, Mara, you alluded to the fact that this is outside of my area of expertise, but I think that maybe the way to kind of answer that, or you know, or you know, attempt to answer the question, is, you know, just because a problem exists in one area doesn't mean that in all other areas it's perfect. I mean, I think that you know, I think it's Dr. Fromer, you know, probably has much more experience with understanding, it seems, I'm just going to assume, you know, the use of medicine and the kind of probably also the policies behind, you know, regulating drug use or narcotic use in this country, and the, you know, the sort of not forward thinking and very kind of harsh method in which, you know, narcotics are policed and enforced, and that probably has knock-on effects like the one she's describing in her question/comment.
Thank you. Malcolm Gissen, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Why should every large city in the US not have an unarmed law enforcement force of social workers and techs trained to deal with nonviolent misdemeanor offenses like disturbances, public drunkenness, rather than armed police officers? Can you imagine how much better the outcomes would be? I think we all agree with that. And the fact that Americans are allowed to carry guns may have a lot to do with this answer, maybe, the answer to this question. Wadie, what's your answer to the?
I mean, I think that's a fair, you know, I think that there's a great deal of work being done by people who, you know, are committed to, you know, trying to fundamentally change the nature of policing to make it much less oppositional and hostile. And it's going to take a lot of work, and those are great suggestions, of course. I mean, but I think there's a fair bit of, I mean, I think some of the things that I'm concerned about are, you know, things that rub me the wrong way, or when someone has a question about, you know, how are we going to pay for that, right? And that's always a kind of a red flag for me when people say, well, we can't do that, we can't, how can we afford that? Which is, it's not just that the money is there and it can be repurposed, it's also, it speaks to a kind of a, you know, a preconceived notion of how society should operate, and that sort of hostility and suspicion of other communities that underlies that. And also, you know, large scale interests that enjoy a good deal of influence and you know, discretion are going to be very loath to give it up without massive popular kind of upheaval. And we've seen that popular upheaval, but translating that into tangible political gains is a tough one. But I mean, I think those are all very interesting and worthy suggestions.
And to your point, there's here like a comment that has like kind of two screens. I don't know whether, you know, I don't want to abuse your time since it's here 11:30, not there. But there's there's an idea in what you say. I mean, the idea of what public is, right? And a heavily armed police seems to form, you know, in the imaginary what public is, but not social services and housing and health and all of the things that would take away from the police, but not from the public, right? From a public dimension. It's like a completely different understanding philosophically of what the public is. So Martin Damon, you have like a very, very long comment. I don't know whether we.
I can speak to it
okay.
Here if we have time. I can.
It's your time, so we
okay.
all, if you do, thank you.
Okay, so this is a very interesting observation, because it speaks to, first of all, it speaks to the idea that, you know, most of us, when we think about getting pulled over by the police, we think we're being pulled over by uniformed police, right? So there's something to be said. Again, you know, I made the comment earlier to Mara about the idea of, we understand what it's like to be pulled over by, or to be stopped and questioned by, plainclothes intelligence agents or things like security agents, which most Americans don't have an understanding or have never been exposed to something like that. And so, the ATF driving dark vehicles with flashing lights, pulling Mr. Diamond over on the side of the road in North Carolina, that's obviously something that's, that sort of out of our general understanding of being pulled over by the police. And you saw, by the way, in the Portland protest, the idea that there were these Homeland Security agents who refused to kind of identify themselves. Again, this idea of this sort of, I could use the term abuse, but maybe I'll be a little more generous and say this sort of selective or kind of creative, that's a real euphemism, this creative deployment of police authority or law enforcement authority like we see here can certainly happen. I can say that I can say two things. So the first is the police are allowed to use a drug dog on a car without any suspicion. If they pull someone over, they can bring a dog and have it, circumvent the car and smell and sniff and whatever. They don't need a warrant. They don't need anything. They can do that once they pull you over. The Supreme Court has said that, that's allowed. And I'll refrain from further comment, but I did throw up my hands. The second point is, and this is exceptionally important, is they wanted to search my car. I said, what's this about? I said no to the search. I'm white, very, very scary. They continued to press me to allow them to search my car, and I kept saying no. Ultimately, they gave up. Now, here's the thing. You have a right to say no when the police ask you to search your car, to search anything. You have a right to say no. The fact that they're asking means they don't have the evidence to do it, okay? Now, could they drum up evidence? Could they find a way to get evidence? I'm not going to say no, never, right? It's that possibility exists, but you have a right to say no. Now, the Supreme Court, in a case from the early 70s, which kind of shocked everyone because, you may have heard of the case of from the 60s from the Warren Court. So these are two different cases. One involving the Fifth Amendment called Miranda versus Arizona. We all know about our Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can be blah, blah, blah. You've seen it all on TV a million times. So in the Fifth Amendment context, that is to say, when the police want to question someone, like when they've arrested someone and they want to question them, interrogate them, they have to give those warnings. In the Fourth Amendment context, when the police want to search someone or search someone's car or person or belongings, they don't have to tell you that you have a right to say no. So the fact that you knew that is already puts you in a very, very, very small minority of Americans who would A, know that, and then B, exercise that right. Because even if you know it, the willingness to stand up to the authorities in a situation like that, this is, I'm assuming this was at nighttime, again, which is, also affects the analysis, I'm sure. And the fact that they gave up is, is also fortunate. So, these are things that, that we should bear in mind. I tell my students, like, this is critical, this idea of the consent search underpinning so much of what the police do. And, just this idea, it's a kind of a cliche, I'm sure you've all heard it before, but like, know your rights. It's not just a cliche, it's actually something important. So I appreciate the comment for sure. I appreciate all the comments and questions.
Well, yeah, that's an excellent point, because in my past work, I have worked, on political, subjectivity, and you're making the distinction between kind of the knowledge of and the kind of like self-understanding of yourself as having rights and acting upon those rights as two very different things. Because in that decision also, to act upon your rights, I mean, if there's such a checkered, let me use one of those, generous words that you have been using, today, knowing the checkered record of the police, if you're the target, you're 100%. I mean, it's your life. So it's kind of like the right versus the life sometimes. We have way more questions, about incarcerations, the cost of incarceration, a lot, of comments, but we're way past the time, and I want to be respectful, of your time here and of everyone's time. So on that note, Wadie, shukran. Thank you so much, so much for this. It has been amazingly illuminating. I'm gonna pass on your articles for people to read them. I owe them the one from last week, so I'm gonna lump that together. And if you have any material that you would like to share, send it to me and I'll make sure everyone gets it as well. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mara. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mara.